Welcome to Module 3 of Pillar 1, the final module of this pillar, the laws of nature. This one's going to be a bit of an interesting one because understanding the laws of nature and how this relates to human behavior is going to probably help make a lot more sense to everything else I've been talking about before, but also more so when we start doing a lot of the actual practical application work to help you start making some shifts and some changes in some of your conditioning learned behaviors and some of the stuff that's getting in the way of you achieving your outcome. So here's what we're going to cover. We're going to focus on Newton's first law of thermodynamics, which I spoke a little bit about in Module 1. Newton's third law of motion, which I haven't spoken about yet. The law of polarity, which I briefly went through. The law of magnetism, again, briefly went through that. And spooky action at a distance, which I did mention and speak about to some degree, but we're going to go into these in a lot more detail. So let's start with Newton's first law of thermodynamics. So Newton's first law of thermodynamics is also very quite similar to the law of conservation. So what the law of conservation clearly states, which we're all governed by, which is, this is similar to Newton's first law of thermodynamics, is that energy is never gained or lost. It is conserved and transformed. So energy in the world, energy in nature, energy in anything, never is gained or lost. That's an illusion of the conscious mind, which we'll explore later. But just so you understand, we're all governed by this. Everything in nature and the universe is governed by this. Okay? So changing states. The conscious brain is unaware of the different forms of energy that it can become. It needs to be taught or guided to see that energy is continuous, but just becomes something new. So the conscious mind can't see this. As the new environment around us or within us changes, so too does the form. So I'm going to explain what that looks like in a moment. But just so you understand, our goal is to help the conscious brain recognize and see quite clearly, and then us feel the truth of this, that energy is always conserved, it just changes form. As the environment around it within us changes, that's where it leads. And I wanted to add in this piece about grief and loss, because we're going to potentially go through this at some stage later down the track. I'm going to go through this with you guys. And I wanted to add in this piece about grief and loss because we're going to go through this at some stage, at some point later in the process. Because grief and loss actually is very tied to this particular law. When we perceive that we've lost something or someone due to a change in circumstances, this is when Newton's first law of thermodynamics can be applied. So remember I said grief and loss is a perception, or gain and loss is a perception of the conscious mind. The conscious brain cannot see, unless it gets taught, how energy can move from one form to another once the environment changes. So we're going to go through this and explain this in a little bit more detail later down the line. So let's look at this and see what I mean. So I often use this example because this really clearly states Newton's first law. So let's take a glass of water, for example, on the left-hand side. So let's say it's 250 mils of water in a liquid state, and then what we're going to do is we're going to change the environment. So we're going to change the environment by putting it in a freezer. Right? So it means we're going to lower the temperature to freezing to 0 degrees, and we're going to take that form and turn it into something different. So we're going to turn it from 250 mils of water to a different form, to a solid, and that's going to be ice. So it's still 250 mils of liquid, 250 mils of water, it's just the environment changed the form. Then we're going to change that form again by changing the environment, by putting it into a pot and boiling the water. So we're going to boil it and let it boil until it changes form again. And it's going to go from 250 mils of solid, liquid, to 250 mils of gas, water vapor. So when you change the environment, the forms change, but the energy maintains itself. It just moves from one form to the next, to the next, to the next, and so on. Let's look at Newton's third law of motion, which I haven't gone through yet with you. So the third law states that for every action or force within nature, there is always an equal and opposite reaction. So the way I generally will talk about this is when it comes to speed and pace. So human beings always want to go faster. Let's go faster. Let's make stuff happen quicker. So we generally believe that when we push harder, or going faster, or doing more, will lead to a quicker outcome or result. This myth, it's a myth, often leads to burnout, which I've seen over 17, 18 years of my life and career, often leads to burnout and dis-ease or diseases in multiple areas of life. Faster does not mean quicker, because remember, the faster you go, the more you're going to have an equal and opposite force coming at you. Okay? So pace and flow is absolutely essential. Nature has a specific flow, a specific speed at which things function and which things move. When we respect that flow and respect the speed, we can actually achieve what we want a lot faster than we expected, even though the distance between point A and point B appears further apart. So another way that I kind of talk about this is if, let's say, for example, you're in a canoe in a river and you wanted to get to whatever endpoint there was down the river. And there are multiple different ways to get there. There's one way which looks, from a visual point of view, looks a lot longer. And then there's another way that looks like a straight line to that point, but it's shorter, a lot shorter, but there's a lot of challenge along the way. Now, naturally, what human beings will generally do is they'll take that shorter route. Reason why is because it looks like it's going to get there faster. But the problem is when we try to speed up nature, speed up everything, we get resistance. So that path commonly and often has a lot of resistance on it. Whereas when you're in the part of the river that's meandering and flowing down to that point, you're with the current, so you're in natural flow, which means there's less work and effort required to actually help you get there, and you actually get there faster because you're not working against the current. You're not working against resistance to get from point A to point B. So let's look at an illustration of this. So I like to use another example as well with an airplane. So in order for an airplane to get off the ground and get into the air, there's a number of factors that are required to help it achieve this. Because one, it's working against Newton's third law of motion, equal and opposite force. It's also working against gravity, wind resistance. There's so many things that are going on here. So in order for this airplane to get this thrust, which is on the left, against the resistance of the wind, few factors need to be in place. One, it needs massive engines with loads and loads of power. It also needs to be the fuselage, so the main section of the airplane needs to be a specific shape. So it needs to look like a point, like a bullet almost, so it can cut through the air easily. And the wings and the tail also need to be a specific shape in order for air to go over and under those wings in such a way that allows it to lift or descend when necessary. But it cannot get up off the ground against the force of gravity and against the resistance coming at it without thrust. So we have speed and thrust that goes against wind and resistance. So you can't have one without the other. The more speed, the more force, the more you're going to experience the opposite. Okay? And human beings, we don't have engines. We're not ergonomically designed, or whatever you call it, to help us get through challenge in that way. However, there are ways to speed up our process from point A to point B that don't require all these extra bits and pieces and lots of extra work and lots of extra force that we've got to put behind it to achieve that result. Let's now explore the law of polarity. So the law of polarity states that everything has two poles. So what that means, there's selfless and selfish, kind and cruel, nice and mean. Everything in the universe is an opposite. You've always got opposites. We live in a world of duality consciously. To the rest of the brain, everything is what is as it is. There's no positives or negatives. But the law of polarity states that there's two poles. They do exist, but they work simultaneously. So, it's the conscious mind that governs the concept of polarity, which I was just mentioning. So we have conscious governance when it comes to polarity. It is this part of the brain that separates things into the opposites, splits them into positives and negatives, kind, cruel, nice, mean, etc. The remainder of the brain is ever present and is constant balance. There's no duality in the rest of the brain. Everything is as it is. Action is just action. There's no positive or negative attachment association to it. That's a conscious construct. Fear and judgment kind of come into play here. So when we view situations or people or experiences or even specific actions from a one-sided perspective because we're conditioned or we have learned behaviors or what have you, this creates a space for fear and judgment to creep in. So fear and judgment come in when we look at an experience from a one-sided point of view, consciously. But remember what I said, in the rest of the brain, there's no such thing as a one side. There's no positive, there's no negative. Everything is as it is. And remember from earlier before when I was talking about the hidden order and all that information that the rest of the brain processes, there's way more information behind the scenes than we are even capable of understanding and aware of on a conscious level. The more we label people from this one-sided perspective, so labels and communication are tied to this, the more we label people from one-sided point of view, the more we can then break communication and connection with them. Because we're then seeing them as mean without kind, cruel mean without nice, cruel without kind, selfish without selfless. Okay? We all have both sides, whether we choose to express them or not, or whether we choose to own them or not. We're all selfish, we're all cruel, we're all mean, just as much as we're all selfless, kind, and nice, and so many others. So, the law of polarity is continuous. There's always opposites. Pleasure and pain, kind and cruel, positive, negative, nice, mean, selfless, selfish. We can keep going and making a list of thousands of different ones, but they're always there and they coexist together at the exact same moment, in the exact same point in time. We may not recognize it consciously, but that doesn't mean they're not there. Okay, we're dealing with laws of science, laws of physics, stuff that's been there a lot longer than all of this stuff, and we're just connecting the dots into human behavior. Next, the law of magnetism. So magnetics. The principle of the law of magnetism is that like poles repel each other and unlike poles attract each other. Similars resist and opposites attract. It's pretty straightforward. Let's look at what I mean by overpowered and underpowered. So when we feel less than, so think about this, when we feel less than or underpowered in relation to someone else or something else, we will attract overpowered energy towards us to assist us in leveling up. So when we're down, we'll attract something with more power than we have to bring us to that power. Okay? When we feel more than or overpowered, so when we're all puffed up and arrogant and in our ego, we will attract something that's of an underpowered energy. We can use that language just to kind of make it make sense. But we'll attract the opposite to bring us down, to bring us off that pedestal, out of ego, out of that puffed up state, and humble us, to create regulation in our brain and then ultimately regulation in the body. So I'm going to bring in the bully and bully dynamic here as a bit of an example of this. So I was bullied a lot as a kid, so I've worked a lot on this dynamic, and I can see the law of magnetism playing out in this space quite a bit. It's very, very interesting space. So we can even relabel it as the challenger and the challenged, rather than the bully and the bullied. So in every case of bullying, there's always an attraction force at play. It's never evident on the surface. We don't look at that. We always think, oh, why is this kid getting it, or why is this person getting it? But there's a physics of opposites attracting opposites that's playing out. So there's a negative attracting a positive attracting a negative. Two sides of a magnet connect to help create growth and transformation for both sides. So oftentimes the kid who's the bullied is the underpowered, is the overprotected, is the perceived weak one, is the one that can't stand up for themselves, the one that doesn't have the ability to own their power and stand in their own position and stand up for themselves. The bully is the opposite, the one who's often under-nurtured, not given attention and care, has a lot more strength because they're a lot more independent and self-sufficient, and can handle shit without anyone kind of directing them and navigating them. But they'll often attract one another because they're two sides of a magnet. They're the opposite poles of a magnet. So they connect to each other to help each other grow, to help each other learn, to help each other maximize their potential. So there'll be a resource at the end of this, a video that I put together about this a while ago, which will explain a little bit more about that in a bit more detail. So here you can see just in this image, which you probably would have seen this in physics when you were younger, in high school, is the law of magnetism. So you've got opposites attracting one another and likes repelling each other. So we often want to be with people who we think are the same as us, but that always causes more problems. The best relationships are the ones where we have opposite interests, so we're literally opposite to each other, but we have similar goals in life, similar things we want to achieve, whether it be financial goals, health goals, relationship goals, family goals, etc. Spooky action at a distance. When I first heard about this experiment, I thought, wow, this is pretty cool. And where it kind of led to and what it formed in terms of other creations that happened afterwards. But this was an experiment that was developed by Albert Einstein, who's a German-born theoretical physicist who has now been widely accepted as one of the world's greatest and most influential physicists of all time. And he did an experiment many, many years ago where he separated two particles of opposite charge and experimented on them individually in two labs on opposite ends of a building. So in one lab they were working on the positron or the negatron, I can't quite remember which one it was. They moved the other one to the other side of the building and had a bunch of scientists working on the other particle, one half of the particle. So as one particle was manipulated in that lab and spun in a particular direction, the other one moved to the exact same degree at the exact same time in the complete opposite direction. Now this experiment has led to the concept and reality and formation of this idea of quantum entanglement. How two particles of equal and opposite value can be intrinsically linked through time and space and affect each other simultaneously. So it doesn't matter how far apart something is, they're always connected. 100% of the time, there's an entanglement there. Have you ever had an experience, think about this for a moment, have you ever had an experience where you're sitting at home or you're at work or you're on the bus home or on the train or in your car and you just think of a person. Think of a person you haven't spoken to in a while. They might live on the opposite end of the world or the opposite side of the city or whatever it is. And soon after you have that thought, that person calls you on the phone. Or while you're in the middle of texting them, they send a message to you. That's called quantum entanglement. That's non-local connection of two opposites connecting to each other despite the space and distance between them. Now, the interesting thing about this experiment, which leads to the volatility piece, this experiment also showed that when these particles were actually separated for long periods of time, they had a very strong desire to reconnect and become whole again, which basically means that positives and negatives can't be separated. they're always synchronous, and they're synthesized in time and space. So they always want to connect, always want to become whole again. And as human beings, we always want to be the most whole, most authentic, most connected versions of who we could be. That's embracing both our upsides, downsides, positives, negatives, selfless, selfish, kind, cruel, nice, mean, etc. The longer the separation from one another, actually, it created an amazing degree and a huge degree of volatility. And this experiment and the separation of particles is what led to, eventually, later down the track with other scientists, led to the formation of the atomic bomb. So the atomic bomb is a separation of particles, positives and negatives, positrons and negatrons. There's a reaction that occurs. The positrons and negatrons collide with each other. They connect back into each other. And because they've been separated for so long, there's a build-up of volatility, and that's what the explosion is. So the more the human beings separate the inseparables, positives and negatives, the greater degree of reactivity we experience. The greater degree of dis-ease and disease we experience within and without the body. Very interesting. So let's have a look at it. So, quantum entanglements. You've got a positron, negatron being pulled apart, which is what the human brain does, right? We separate the inseparables consciously. Then they move into positive on one hand, negative on the other hand, which is what happened at Spooky Action at a Distance within the lab. But they just wanted to go back to each other. Constantly wanted to be connected. Constantly wanted to be synthesized with one another. Constantly wanted to be whole. All of us, whether we are aware of this or not, consciously and unconsciously, consciously sometimes, but definitely unconsciously, want to be whole beings. We want to be loved and appreciated for every part of who we are. But until we can embrace every part of who we are, we won't see the reflection of that out there in the world around us. This is an awesome quote one of my mentors has shared before. When you know that bad things aren't so terrible and good things aren't so terrific, you can be quietly grateful for whatever occurs. Balance is neither pessimism nor optimism. It's neither positive or negative, neither good nor bad. It's a balance of both. So, we've got some resources for this particular module. We've got all the different laws, so you can see what they all are and how they all work. So they're all the different laws of nature, which you can download below. And I'm going to be sharing a video on bullying and magnetics and how that kind of ties in. And you can download that below as well and have a look at it. And if you have any questions, please just send them across through the support email. So remember, ready, set, action. This is your time to take action, to get as much value, as much information as you need to help you complete this program and achieve the results and outcomes that we're aiming for, or that you're aiming for. So download the Laws of Nature PDF below and click below to access the video about bullying and magnetics to help you get a bit of a deeper understanding about how those two kind of tie in together. But this is us now for Module 3 of Pillar 1. We have now completed all of Pillar 1. You'll be moving into Pillar 2 very shortly. And Pillar 2 will be discussing and going through everything related to values and what that actually means in terms of how we're going to navigate moving forward. I look forward to seeing you in Pillar 2. Hope you enjoyed everything that you've gained and learned and some background knowledge in Pillar 1. And we're going to be using a lot of this and applying a lot of this when we get to a lot more of the practical applications in the next couple of pillars. Look forward to seeing you in Pillar 2.